Yeah. So what's the topic on today's menu?
Chinese democracy, or more specifically, the chance of war between China and Taiwan. Welcome to Ad Hoc Degeneracy, the show where Eric and I break down current events, then place a likelihood on whether or not they will actually occur. And I'm Josh. I'm a corporate intelligence professional who spent my career helping some of the world's largest organizations navigate their most complex intelligence challenges. In this marriage of narratives and numbers, we want people to have enough background information so they can understand what's exactly going on. If people don't correctly understand the background, then the solutions that they build for these potential problems will also be lacking. Einstein once said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem or the background and 5 minutes thinking about the solution or what's going to happen.
I'm Eric. I'm the degenerate half of the show. So after understanding the problem, it's possible to move on to solutions. But instead of offering one solution, we want to provide you with as many realistic scenarios as possible, then weight the outcomes with probabilities. This is a really important thought exercise because it forces us to understand arguments we wouldn't agree with or usually give the time of day. That way, we can give accurate predictions instead of trying to justify what we want happen.
As we said, let's begin with some of the background, and let's start our journey to the east with China and Taiwan, or as some would say, one China. Our 5,000 years of Chinese history for today just begins in 1912, the year the last emperor of China abdicated and chaos emerged in China that hasn't really ended even today, some would say.
Not long after the last emperor abdicated, the Japanese invaded. Then World War II happened. Then, after World War II, came the Chinese Civil War. The modern rift between China and Taiwan, or as some would say, China and China, began with this Civil War, and that's where we'll also begin our 5,000 years of Chinese history.
So the Chinese Civil War was essentially the nationalists, or KMT, as you may hear us refer to them as, or the Kuomintang, versus the communists, or the CCP, Chinese Communist Party. Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao Zedong on the communist side. Some would even say communism versus capitalism, or authoritarianism versus liberalism. There's a lot of different ways to describe this conflict. And again, while the nationalists started out with a huge advantage in terms of personnel and materiel, they ultimately lost. Instead of surrendering, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, the KMT, they fled to the island of Taiwan, where they stayed in power for many years before the country also ultimately became a democracy. Korea had a very similar story, and so why do we have, say, a North Korea and a South Korea who are both still technically at war, but China and Taiwan, if you ask anyone kind of on either side, any regular person on either side of the Taiwan Straits, they seem to be on pretty good terms.
Unlike North and South Korea, there's been a softening of relations between China and Taiwan, or as some would say, China and China. In the 1980s, the relationship between China and Taiwan began to soften with Lee Teng-hui becoming president. He had no connection to mainland China, so the whole idea of quote unquote returning to somewhere he'd never been was a bit weird. The leaders of China and Taiwan initiated contact with each other when Lee came to office.
That also coincides with the opening up within China as well. So it was kind of a good time for both parties to start working together. And again, both sides agreed that there should be, in theory, one China. I'm kind of using, scare quotes, if you will. But they couldn't compromise on what would actually be, who would be in charge of that one China. Of course, there's an added complication these days in that many Taiwanese think of Taiwan not as China, but as Taiwan, a separate identity, and that it should be recognized as its own independent entity. Having Taiwan become a part of China but still do its own thing technically falls under the idea of China, of one China, two systems, but it's obviously a lot more complicated than we've just described.
Let's talk about one China, two systems. So the whole idea of one China, two systems became quite popular when China also started opening up. It was the official like foreign policy, right? For a little while there. Yeah. So a good example of one China, two systems working is if you look at former colonies like Hong Kong and Macau. When you visit Hong Kong and Macau, or at least before 2019, they felt like very different countries from mainland China.
Exactly. Hong Kong has its own separate legal system. It, I guess you could say, again, scare quotes, quote unquote, elects its own leaders. And, you can access things like Facebook and YouTube. It's outside of the Great Firewall that applies to mainland China. Citizens of Hong Kong can even do things like read about or even demonstrate about the Taiwan Tiananmen Square massacre, excuse me. And this all really happened because mainland China agreed to let Macau and Hong Kong have their own governments for at least 50 years before merging with the mainland, which again goes back to about 1997, an agreement between the former masters of Hong Kong, the British, and the former masters of Macau, Portugal. When thinking about one China, two systems, it's kind of easy to see why that could happen.
Likewise, China has spent the past 40 years working towards economic and cultural integration with Taiwan. And to their credit, they've done a great job of that integration.
Exactly. I mean, they're very good trading partners. I think a big part of the success of reform and opening up in China is a part because of its long-standing partnership with Taiwan, and they're each other's, top 10 export-import partners. There's tons and tons of business going both ways, both from an economic perspective, from a cultural perspective. Particularly in the 80s and 90s, Taiwanese culture became very prominent in mainland China. Taiwanese music was quite popular. There's still some lingering cultural impact, I think, of Taiwanese culture in mainland China. So they've become close in many ways, although maybe not necessarily politically close, although culturally and economically they've become quite intertwined.
It's easy to forget how big these diplomatic wins have been for mainland China and the Communist Party. When you look at what happened with Hong Kong, what happened with Macau, China is clearly willing to play the long, peaceful game for this slow economic integration. And I think that a lot of people in Taiwan are also for that, just from all the money that's being made with these two countries not going to war and being increasing trading partners. The standard of living in Taiwan is pretty high, and the higher it increases in China, the more rich Taiwan's going to become anyways. But on the other hand, many Taiwanese don't necessarily see themselves as mainlanders. So while they speak Mandarin and trace their ancestors to mainland China, that's about as far as their connection goes, and the idea of being ruled under the CCP is unpalatable.
In many respects, many people in South Korea or Japan have become very wealthy doing business with China. Again, both those countries are also very well integrated with China, both economically and culturally. But they wouldn't necessarily consider themselves wanting to be a part of mainland China by any stretch. So in conclusion, China and Taiwan have some very deep cultural ties and heritage, just like North and South Korea, or even like Russia and Ukraine, or even East and West Germany. But their respective governments also have some large differences in philosophies, between how each country wants to be governed. Again, just like North and South Korea, Russia and Ukraine, etc. Likewise, just like with Russia and Ukraine, China has a strong desire to be seen as the cultural epicenter or the leader of that cultural world, and will do everything in its power to minimize the differences between China and Taiwan, kind of similarly to what Russia has done with Ukraine.
I also think that like China is looking at the shell shock of Russia, and anything that they'd plan to do is it's probably splashed a lot of cold water on anything they plan to do.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting factor for our calculations is like, what if the Ukraine war went really smoothly, right? Like, what if Russia just steamrolled the country and like took over Kiev and killed everyone, and Zelensky is dead and all that stuff? I mean, we would be probably looking at a very different set of calculus on the part of Beijing in terms of a relationship with Taiwan, right? They took it over, knocked over the government, were able to kind of negotiate some kind of settlement. Sanctions were lifted. Russian troops left Ukraine, but there was a puppet government in charge. All that kind of stuff. Beijing would definitely be looking at this very differently, for sure.
Right, and that's what's really tricky. So let's say end of 2023. So what are the odds that Beijing invades Taiwan before 2023? And let's clarify. So one of the things I think is really interesting is like, should we just say boots on the ground, soldiers on the beach, or do we think like some sort of naval blockade slash hostage situation also counts?
I think that would be fair. Like the hostage situation as well. I'm kind of even tempted to even say like bombardments, because I think that's, even if there was bombardments, that's pretty significant in terms of the way that relationship would change, and the impact it would have around the world. Like, if even if their uninhabited islands were getting bombed or something like that, or Taiwanese fortifications on some of those islands were being destroyed, that's pretty significant, I think.
Yeah, or there being like a Chinese base on Taiwan for whatever.
Yeah, if they were to seize, some of those islands, I forget the name. Like, there's obviously like Taiwan, the island, but there's a string of islands that are between it and the mainland. Some of which are controlled by Taiwan, some by China. Maybe the mainland kind of starts to seize some of those as they, put their artillery in closer range of the mainland.
Right. So what are now that we've got these definitions, what are your odds?
For me, it's got to be I would say 93% chance that they don't invade. So there's that 7% chance that they take the plunge and they decide to end civilization as we know it. Which is what's kind of on the table, right? Well, I mean, that said, maybe not. If they were to make that decision, it's because a lot of other things may have changed around the world that would make that invasion more successful and less civilization ending.
Yeah, I would probably say there's like a 1 or 2% chance they invade Taiwan next year. It's pretty low. And I think if Russia, so the question is, why did Ukraine get invaded? And why are we so sure that China will not invade Taiwan? What is the difference going on there? Because they both, if you just look at like dictators' remarks, they both have very similar rhetoric.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And again, no one thought, well, not no one, but not as many Western commentators in particular, thought that Russia would go ahead with the invasion of Ukraine back in, January, February. It just seems so like such a strategic blunder in many respects. Well, I mean, we're living through to see that strategic blunder in action now. But I think the differences and why do we think it's more remote is China just has a lot more to lose by invading Taiwan than it has to gain. In the Ukraine situation, it's quite a bit different in that I think Putin's calculus. I mean, this is always you run into issues where you try to predict someone like that's thought process. But I think he probably thought he could get the war over with fairly quickly, and the pushback from around the world wouldn't be quite to the same degree. I think China is very aware of how damaging something like this would be, and that's kind of an understatement, would be to their international reputation, not only in the West, but also in the developing world as well.
Well, I agree. I also think to add on top of that, China is a much less homogenous place than Russia.
So you're saying it's more
Like Russia,
heterogeneous.
yeah, because I think Putin has spent the last 20 years stamping out, opposition, which tends to lead to disasters like this. And obviously Xi Jinping with the whole Bo Xilai thing, has also spent quite a bit of time stamping out opposition. But the difference is China's 1.3 billion people, Russia's 100 some odd million. So there's so much more opposition to stamp out. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and I think the party itself is much more attuned to public sentiment in a way that maybe Russia's government is not. Um, I think.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
And well, I was going to say, and if you ask a lot of Chinese people, China is Taiwan anyway. Whereas I think if you asked a lot of Ukrainians before the war, starting in 2014 or even starting before that, is Ukraine more closely aligned with Russia or Europe? You have to wonder what percentage of them would say Europe.
Yeah, or Russians, right? Like how many Russians would say, "Oh yeah, Ukraine is a part of our polity. Ukraine is a part of our country." Probably not as many as would say the same thing about Taiwan and China.
Right. And so that's an important calculus too. So there's a couple things going on, right? As far as why China would not invade Taiwan. There's a lot going for it. One one is China's not dumb. They understand the economic costs of doing it. Two would be less homogeny than somewhere like Russia, less political homogeny than somewhere like Russia, right? Be another reason. Three would be how much more China is already a part of Taiwan. Okay, so why would China invade Taiwan?
I think it come down to domestic reasons, domestic, and by that I mean internal dynamics within the Chinese Communist Party, where they were concerned about the their own position within mainland China, and they wanted an external event to kind of help them to shore up their support domestically, or they really saw a weakness in Taiwan where they could kind of finally wrap that long-standing issue up, where even Chairman Mao wasn't able to kind of consolidate his rule over all of quote unquote China. Um, so if there was some chaos in Taiwan or chaos within the CPC leadership, that's kind of when you would start to consider that attack being more likely, or that invasion being more likely.
Yeah, I completely agree. It would have to be the internal machinations of China to cause the invasion of Taiwan. I don't think that there's any like I think that would be the logical reason, right? Is Xi Jinping or whoever needs to shore up power, so let's go start a war. And it's also I've been thinking about this a lot. Um when dictators are suffering from long term, how many dictators have suffered from long term economic stagnation or sort of long-term economic stagnation and not caused massive destruction, right? Like how many like states have had a Japan, how many dictatorships have had a Japan style economic stagnation and not started a war?
Yeah, I mean that's a great way to kickstart your economy, right? Is if go growth and to both solidify your control, but also, put the the society's industrial capacity to work in a certain way.
Right.
You know,
And Russia,
whether that how successful that would be is another thing because you're kind of cut off from the global society. But you're totally right. I mean, in terms of how that calculation could go, I mean, there's definitely economic benefits, for lack of a better word, to that invasion.
right. And so I could see that being a reason for the invasion of Taiwan. But at the same time, that would take many years to fulfill, right? Like we'd have to see years of Chinese economic stagnation to start a war for that reason.
Yeah, where they became so desperate that they were willing to, because again, it's not a it's a risk. It's not a from the CDPC leadership perspective. It's not like you're guaranteed to shore up your support. I mean, sure, it makes you easy to take care of your immediate enemies because you have new powers or people will understand you wanting to take care of anti-war elements, but you create new enemies, right? By conscription or the chaos and the violence that a war brings. So it's not a risk-free kind of endeavor.
I think all of this talk of like China invading Taiwan currently, that's why it's posturing for now. But it sounds like we're both on the same page that it's generally posturing and the odds are really small.
Right. And it's not impossible. I mean, again, both of us have given our percentages. There's still a chance that this could happen, as we said, most likely because of miscalculations or some kind of domestic issue on the Chinese side where, kind of similar to Russia, maybe they miscalculate how successful they would be in terms of that invasion or how vulnerable their position is domestically, that it's determined that the best course of action is to, invade this, in many ways, quite peaceful country of 25 million people.
If we see sort of a 2008 or Lehman style economic crisis coming out of whatever is brewing in China, whatever's going on with this like Chinese, like sort of scary economic thing, if that happens, coupled with like food instability stemming from the Russian Ukrainian war, then I do think that timeline does get sped up quite a bit. But we don't know the results of this Chinese sort of economic danger is yet. We don't know the scale of it. It could be being blown out of proportion or it could be really bad. And so if it's really, really bad, then China invading Taiwan after 5 years of economic stagnation could easily be China invades Taiwan after 18 months or a year of economic stagnation.
Yeah, and I think the domestic political angle in Taiwan is also kind of worth paying attention to as well, because again, right now the Taiwanese government is led or Taiwan, excuse me, is led by a government that is less in favor of closer relations with Taiwan, not with mainland China. Excuse me, not to say that they're against closer relations with mainland China, but compared to the KMT, which is quite funny that the KMT has now become kind of the pro-China party in many respects. The DPP, who's currently in power, are more cautious, I guess, about closer relations with China. So it's interesting to see if there's a leader in Taiwan who is kind of more willing to play ball with the CCP, what does that do for their calculus versus maybe a more easily vilified Taiwanese leader who the CCP can say, oh, this person is in favor of even an independence declaration or something like that, where they can very clearly justify an invasion versus, like a Ma Ying-jeou, like the former KMT president of Taiwan, who is very conciliatory towards China, mainland China.
And that's a really good point because, in the past 40 years, that's probably ebbed and flowed. Support for mainland China has ebbed and flowed.
Yeah, exactly, and that's kind of one of the interesting changes in Taiwanese politics is that the KMT has become, or the Nationalist Party has become just in many respects another political party in Taiwan, and then that party is now in favor in many ways of a closer relationship, closer business and economic relationship with China. Whereas the DPP has become much more independence minded. Not I don't want to say independence minded, but much less conciliatory towards mainland China.
Right. Right. So it could also be we could also see a scenario where the party that is more pro China is in power and does something to appease the Chinese government, either like giving islands or something like that. Probably something like we saw with Ukraine in 2014 with Viktor Yanukovych.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Where they're willing to, it's easier for them to kind of walk back a military confrontation because they're seen as they're able to make those concessions in a way that maybe a different party would not be able to, like in terms of their own political calculus within Taiwan is saying they can't be seen to be giving up any ground to China. They have to stand up to them in a way that kind of pushes this kind of brinksmanship that creates a conflict between the two parties. So it's you could definitely see a situation where you kind of get again, not to say that the DPP or the KMT are better for Taiwan, but like you can see a situation where the specific leader in Taiwan, the specific leader in mainland China, where they're just not able to come to agreement and then they come to blows, where there's other leaders that maybe would be able to kind of find a peaceful way to negotiate that. Whereas, so that's what that, for me at least, that's where that 7% kind of comes into play. Is there's a chance that maybe a more hawkish mainland, a more hawkish Taiwan creates a conflict, whereas by the vast majority, it's kind of unlikely.
The bet is that the invasion is unlikely to happen this year and next, but is increasingly likely to happen over time, shall we say?
I mean, at least for the next 2 years. I mean, this definitely seems like the most likely it's been, pretty much in our lifetime. So like, since Geiger Kaifeng began, so since like the late 70s. Well, we hope obviously that this event doesn't come to pass, not just because we bet on it, but because it impacts the lives of literally billions of people around the world. But again, we're here just to kind of give you a new mathematical way to think about world events and not necessarily to put a ton of value judgment behind them. So both of us kind of seem to be in agreement, right, Eric? Like we're pretty close on our predictions in terms of what's likely to happen. But things can change very fast, as we've seen in the Ukrainian example. So we'll continue to monitor and now that we've have this publicly shared. I mean, when it eventually does happen, or not eventually, but if it does happen, and that coup against Xi Jinping is really actually true, and he's out of power, and there's a new person in charge, and that person decides that the best way to shore up their support is to invade Taiwan. Well, it was nice knowing you, listener. The world is probably going to end.
So, final disclaimer, this is not investment advice. This is not betting advice. It's two dudes hanging out, talking about the future.
Stay
Boom.
stay degenerate.
Stay degenerate.
The ending music.